Hello everybody, welcome to Planet FPL, the world where everything revolves around Fantasy Premier League. My name's Suj.
And my name is James.
And today, James, no poll, no votes,
it didn't need that, mate. So this is Money in Football, which is a podcast we normally do on Patreon, most commonly on a Thursday.
Yeah.
The big story that obviously broke last Friday was something that I didn't think should be behind a paywall, and I think most people would probably want to hear us discuss it. There was shocking news Friday whilst I was drinking hot lemons and feeling sorry for myself and doing a live stream, when this idiot on my right decided to send me links. I'm doing the stream and I'm like, why is Suj sending me links? He knows I'm working live. And it was one of them, genuinely, it's not often I get sent a story and I think, oh my God. and it was one of them.
I didn't know I'd send it to you live in the middle of the stream.
Yeah.
And only when I caught up on the intro of the live stream that I'd realised that you'd actually, in the middle of Ask James, I'd dropped a bombshell on you.
Everton were obviously given a 10-point deduction by the Premier League's, in quote, independent commission on Friday afternoon, that now sees them drop to 19th, joint bottom of the league, from 14 points to 4 points. That point deduction is immediate and in place. And it is due to essentially Everton's failure to stay within the profit sustainability
PSR.
rules. Yeah, PSR.
FFP, PSR.
We could go
LMNP.
FFP. Same shit, basically. Yeah. Which allows for losses of, Suj is going to tell us, 105 million over 3 years.
Correct.
I think part of the problem of what's happened for Everton is they believe they were within it. And as the closer to judgment come round, it was like, okay, maybe we're not. Do you feel like that's played a significant part in the overall ruling?
In the punishment, you mean?
Yeah.
So the ruling is guilty or not guilty. They admitted to it.
Yeah, they're guilty.
They admitted to it. So where you're saying that they were trying to blag it and say that they weren't guilty, Everton have accepted that they were in the wrong. What they're now disputing is the severity of the punishment versus the crime. And I can understand, like, for a lot of people, it's confusing because if you look at even the Athletic, right? I've got the article right in front of me for the Athletic. And the headline there is record £355 million losses at Everton. That's not factually incorrect, is it? £355 million is a lot of money to lose, and Everton have lost £355 million, which is a Premier League record. But the punishment is not about that £355 million loss. It's £124.5 million versus 105. So if you looked at that 355 headline number, you'd say that they've broken FFP by a total of £250 million. It's not. The actual crime or breach is only £19.5 million over a 3-year period.
Yeah, that's a lot to... there's reasons why it's not all of it. Yeah. Primarily, obviously, the building of the new stadium. So there's certain things where you can have expenditure and it doesn't come off your
correct
PSR. Investment in infrastructure, stadiums, women's team, youth football, I mean, charity work. There's a couple of others maybe as well. Don't go onto this PSR report. So Everton have obviously already invested heavily in terms of the build of Bramley Moor Dock, which is going up. Looks like it's going to be a great stadium. It's going to be used at the Euros. But it's interesting to go back to that 124.5 million number that you said. Once you kind of get around all the noise, the reality here is that Everton are 19.5 million out of sync. Yep. That's really what they are out of sync here. 19.5 million.
The other thing is COVID during that period, losses and stuff like that. They over exaggerated. Did they? Didn't they?
We did a comparison a really long time ago on Everton and Aston Villa's. The amount the two clubs were claiming they lost over COVID, and it was, I can't remember what the numbers were, but it was laughable what Everton was saying.
Extremely high compared to the others. So yes, that 19.5 million is, again, I would call it a paper loss. Creative accounting.
It's because, one Cenk Tosun.
Yeah, once you've moved a player from once you've moved the debt from this side to that side, or you've sold a player, or you've amortized slightly differently, or whatever, they could easily. That 19.5 could be 30. It could be I doubt it's going to be less, but it could be a little bit more. I think it's creative accounting, but £19.5 million breach for 10 points deducted.
Fair?
Well, I've seen conversations where people have said, well, they would have been better off going into administration because that's a 9-point deduction, and they could have cleared a bunch of debt. And let's be honest, if you go into administration, you're going to shaft a few people as well because you're not going to repay all of that debt. So they've done the right thing in the sense of not going into administration. But if administration is 9 points, then I don't see how 10 points is fair, because administration is a worse thing to happen than breach FFP. Because in this situation, at least the club/owner are going to have to find a way to finance the debt and the deficit, whereas going into administration saying I'm not going to pay my debts, or I'm only going to pay part of my debts. So why would you get less of a fine?
Yeah, but it wouldn't have been
punishment.
I mean, in administration, 1 point better off, or out of it, 1 point worse off. I mean, from that, it doesn't necessarily add up. I mean, part of the problem here is, and one of the reasons for Everton's annoyance on the actual punishment, is a couple of things. One is, and we will mention City and Chelsea briefly, but we don't want to be here for 10 hours. Everton, it could be argued, have gained no sporting advantage from what they've done. They've massively overspent. Even Evertonians have every right to be upset at the punishment.
Hey, they might have got relegated had they not had Alex Iwobi as part of their team.
Yeah, okay. So
they might have got relegated had Neil Namope not popped up in their team last year.
When they appointed Rafa Benitez, which was 2 summers ago.
Yeah.
And Everton budgeted to finish 6th, which, when you think about it, is a little bit laughable that's what they were budgeting for. It was aiming high, right? It was, and this was already a period where the spending was already calming down.
But that, are you saying they didn't gain any sporting advantage?
Well, based on what they were targeting, no. The money they've spent has not put them in a better position.
No, but that's not down to the money being spent. That's down to the money being spent poorly. If Man City now fell off a cliff and finished 9th or 10th or 11th in the table, are you going to disregard their financial fidelity because they didn't perform as well as they should have?
City arguably have gained clear advantage, right? They've already won shit. Yeah, Everton haven't done anything over this period.
They've tried.
Really. They tried.
The intent was there for them to gain a sporting advantage, i.e. perform higher in the table. If they were too bad to be able to do it, that's their fault. I think City have done the same, but they have managed to get that advantage because they've bought better players and they've got a better manager and stuff like that. But yeah, I think if you start trying to look at whether or not they got a sporting advantage or not, then the subjectivity of 11 versus 11 comes into it. The intent was there always. Like, if we're going to overspend and buy players like Iwobi and stuff that they spend too much money on, you could argue.
Shit. They spent a lot of money on shit. Even Evertonians aren't going to deny that.
That's their fault.
And Everton fans have been screaming for a long time about their unhappiness about the way their football club is run, right? There's been a tipping point, and we know there's a potential change with the interest from 7-7 partners, which I'd also suggest Everton may not particularly want as their new owners, because there's some shady stuff there as well. Might even be better off with the devil that they know. But part of the argument I was making, Suj, and I think it was part Everton's, is their failures have been breaches of financial irregularities, if you will. Therefore, their punishment should also have been financial, i.e. banning them from signing players for a couple of transfer windows, which most Evertonians would say, based on their historical purchases over the last 5 years or so, probably would be a blessing in disguise for the football club, based on some of the players they've bought. So should it be a sporting sanction when the punishment is for financial problems? Because if you did, say, ban them from 2 transfer windows from signing players, you are still imposing a penalty on the sporting side of the football club, right?
I don't think you can separate the finances and the sport anymore from that point of view.
Why?
it's not directly direct correlation. But if you looked at the Premier League table, the more money you spend, the higher up you finish.
Sure.
Therefore, the finances and the sport are linked. Like, it just doesn't happen, like so Leicester winning the league and what have you, where they've got lower budgets. So
it did happen.
It did
I'm
once.
aware.
I think you can't say that the finances and what actually happens on the pitch are not related anymore, because they clearly are. Better teams spend more money, get better players, and therefore finish higher in the table. So if you impose a financial sanction and a transfer window ban like you're talking about, it will have an impact on the sporting side of things, even though you feel like it's a non-sporting punishment.
Do you, however, feel, though, that the 10 points is over the top? Or do you deem it fair? What was your reaction? My reaction was, oh my God, like I said to you, because I'd been saying on the pod for a couple of weeks that the request had been that it was a maximum punishment of 12 points. And I did not think that. I thought if Everton got a points deduction, it would certainly be in the single digits, like 3-4 points, something like that, with probably a heavy fine or some sort of transfer embargo to go with it. When I saw the 10 points, I was generally properly shocked.
I don't know if I was shocked. I was shocked that we'd got the news and it'd come out all of a sudden as in terms of shock of a bombshell being dropped. But the actual amount of points, I suppose, I kind of went through a few various stages of thought process. So firstly, I looked at the table. I'm like, okay, what does 10 points actually mean as a punishment for them in real terms? And I looked at where it would leave them. And so my first reaction was actually, just take it on the chin, because you're probably still going to not get relegated, in my opinion. So then I was like, okay, is it too harsh a punishment? Like 15 points or 20 points, I feel like would have been a conversation to be had that they now are in a relegation scrap. But 10 points, I don't think puts them necessarily in a relegation scrap. I'd still back them, as would most pundits, to get out.
They're definitely in a relegation scrap.
But they'll get out.
I agree, and that's...
And it's quite early in the season, I would say, as well. We're a third of the way through, just under.
If this punishment had been handed out in pre-season, before the season started, we'd have all gone, Everton will get relegated.
Probably, you're right, yeah.
Because we'd have looked at it and we'd have gone, I don't see Everton getting to...
Considering what's happened the last two seasons, yeah,
example,
they've been right on the cusp for 2 years in a row.
Yeah.
The second thought after I'd looked at the table and thinking, is this a real punishment? Because if they don't get relegated, this is no punishment at all. There's just take it on the chin and move on. It's only really a punishment if it impacts what happens and they get relegated. Maybe finish a couple of places lower than they would.
There is an element of punishment there in, let's just say, and I think most of us think Everton will still stay up, I think, subject to their players staying fit, very importantly. But let's say Everton finish 17th rather than finishing maybe 13th or 12th. You're looking at a difference there of sort of 8 to 10 million.
Yeah, in prize money, it's 2 million a place roughly in the Premier League. I get that, but just staying in the Premier League's kind of enough more than anything else. The second thing I looked at to decide whether or not I think it's fair is relative to other punishments. What have other people with similar crimes been given? And administration for the likes of Portsmouth probably won. You guys got fined 12 points, but then it got taken back. This is a long time ago, though. Pre-Premier League. So I don't know if there's as much to compare against. And then you kind of think, okay, well, who else is in the same boat right now? Which is where a lot of people would want the conversation to go. Man City and Chelsea, let's say, are in the same boat. But Man City definitely. What does that mean for that punishment? So I think the overriding feeling for a lot of people was, if this is 10 points, then Man City should be looking at the National League or something like that. I don't know if I agree with that, but they are slightly different, I think, in the sense that the Man City stuff is fraud, right? Whereas Everton's a breach of the profit and sustainability, but I don't think they've been accused of fraud or anything underhand in covering things up. They've just spent more than they can afford to. To be honest, whereas Man City's a lot more criminal in terms of what they've been accused of is covering things up, false sponsorship agreements, all this kind of stuff.
Well, with Man City, it's going to come down to probably essentially, cut a long story short, if the Premier League can prove what they believe, which is Manchester City have lied.
Yeah,
and we've spoken before.
And Everton haven't lied; they've just overspent.
I don't want to say Everton haven't lied, because they've obviously tried to cite mitigating circumstance. I think it's probably important to clarify.
Opinions.
I don't think Everton have tried to game the system. Like,
No.
I think they've willingly been trying to stay within. They realised they were in a problem, right? They approached the Premier League in 2021 and said, like, look, we're going to be really close here. What do we need to do to stay within this 105 million? One of the agreements was that the Premier League would have to authorise Everton's attempts to sign players and stuff. I don't quite know how Everton then spent nearly £40 million on Amadou Onana, who's a good player, but nevertheless, I think the problem there is that they didn't then follow the things that were needed. But Everton obviously cited mitigating circumstances. One, obviously, we said is the stadium project. And it was highlighted that the difference of opinion on how loans to fund the scheme could be accounted for is what Everton were putting up as one mitigating circumstance. They also said, was citing the impact of COVID-19, which I think you and I had investigated previously and agreed that Everton were over-egging that in terms of the amount that they reckoned they would cost. And we used Aston Villa as a reference of a similar-sized football club, similar attendances, etc. There were also two players that were referenced who we can only refer to as Player Y and Player X. Everton's attempts to sell Player Y didn't work, but they'd also given this player a new contract as well. Player X is a player who was bought for a large sum of money, who they then couldn't use anymore. Everton tried to mitigate that they could sue the player for around about 10 million, but didn't due to the player's mental health and well-being. It was also a citation that Tottenham had robbed them for Richarlison and paid Everton 20 million less than what Everton believed the value of Richarlison should be, and Tottenham took advantage of the situation. I don't know, personally, on what I've seen over the last 15 months, I feel like I've been taken advantage of, and we paid about 20 million too much. But actually, I think 60 million was probably fair market value, to be totally honest. Tottenham, if Tottenham sold him tomorrow, I don't know if Tottenham would get 60 million. Let's put it that way.
I look at it that way as well. I agree with you. I think it's probably a fair price. Just
the other thing that they cited was their transparent cooperation with the Premier League. So, and I think that goes back to the fact, again, they tried to seek a little bit of help themselves in 2021. But I think the fact that's really gone against them as well is the fact that the numbers have changed, right? Several times. So Everton were trying to say, I think it's 87.1 million. They were trying to say was their losses for the 3 years. And the Premier League originally put it at 120 point something. And then on reassessment, Everton had to come back and go, yeah, shit, we've failed this. And the Premier League actually bumped up Everton another few million based on their own reanalysis, which I think it included, was it 40,000 documents?
Yeah.
I mean, it's an insane number. And I think that does answer for some people a lot of, well, why does this take so long? Yeah, that's one of the general fans' annoyance, right? Why wasn't this dealt with? The Premier League, by the way, wanted to push for this punishment to be in place before the end of last season, which obviously would have seen Everton relegated unless the City stay up. More on that sort of thing in a second. But the independent commission were like, there's no way that's realistic based on the evidence that needs to be researched. So for those who are like, well, where's the analysis on Man City? Where's the final result? 40,000 documents for one charge against Everton that took them from, March to now, basically, to make a decision. So you can imagine how long it's going to take for Man City's 100 plus, which I think actually when you condense it, I was reading something interesting. I forget the name of the person who did a really good thread on Twitter. It's actually City's 115. You can band in together to make it around about 32. But even still, there's obviously far more documentation to go through on Manchester City than there is in Everton.
You're talking about invoices, contracts, all this kind of stuff.
They are trying to put stuff in place, the Premier League. Therefore, if this sort of situation happens again, that they will be a lot quicker to react and act upon it. I feel very uncomfortable always about teams having points deductions for misdemeanors of things that happened in the past. I'm generally quite uncomfortable with points deductions anyway, in the sense that the impact it has on fans, teams, players. I don't like goalposts being moved in the middle of the season. Like, I think, say, if an independent commission had deemed Everton 10 points guilty and the punishment had been given out in May, like, then what? Okay, Leicester stay up, Everton go down. Yeah, well, Everton are going to appeal. Like, it's way too messy.
I agree.
The goalposts move during the season. At least with this one, it's early enough in the season where Everton know where they stand at the moment. They know what they need to do, right? They need to get 3 more points than Burnley, Sheffield United and Luton for the rest of the season. And over the course of the 26 games that remain, I think most of us think that they'll do that. If they play like they've played recently, then I think they'll end up doing it quite comfortably. I think we all think the line will be much lower this year, right? With 30 points might even be enough to stay up, for example. And in other seasons, as you alluded to, Everton would have gone.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you that I don't like it in the middle of the season. What I don't like is also that it's subjective. Like we've talked, is 10 points fair? Is it not? Where they come up with this number in terms of how many points is subjective at the end of the day. Like if they'd come around and said 8 points, would we be having a different conversation as you're saying, deal with Everton
and move on? No, we'd be having the same conversation.
Or if it was 20 points, we'd be having a very different conversation as well.
If it was 20 points, we'd be saying, oh, they're in massive, massive trouble.
I think, yeah, if there are punishments that are doled out for these kind of breaches, I would like to see them not retrospective, but more in the future. And before a season starts.
I agree,
so,
massively.
Just like say, okay, next season you are not in the FA Cup, or next season you'll be starting 2 divisions lower, or whatever.
By the way, Everton are much better off having the -10 now than at the start of next season.
Probably.
But yeah, I'm uncomfortable with that. I mean, what happens in the circumstance? It's only hypothetical at the moment. But let's say they went right -30 points to Man City. And say you get invested in a title race, freeway between City, Arsenal, Liverpool, and then in April they go, yes, City -30. I mean, it kind of fabricates everything that's happened, right? It makes it not real, like what you've been watching and stuff. I would want that punishment, and I think the Premier League will want that punishment to be given in a pre-season. The problem with that is, like, whatever it is, let's say it's relegation, just hypothetically. City, they say, right, City, you're expelled from the Premier League. Right, they're going to appeal.
Yep.
So your time frame from end of season to start of season. What do they do if they decide in January, yeah, shit, we're going to relegate Man City? Well, in the middle of the season, then what?
Yeah.
Changes everything. So I'm really uncomfortable, and I think the Premier League needs to think very, very carefully with the City case in terms of what they do if City are proven guilty of these charges, etc. Because Everton fans will obviously be sitting there right now going, well, if this is this for us, then for them it's got to be, we know the charges are there. There's no charge currently against Chelsea, by the way, but we are expecting something. That's because of
this new
payments with Abramovich.
Yeah, and it goes back to his era where a few bits of paperwork came up with some Putin cronies.
Nice.
And Abramovich was helping funnel money through to Putin through some back doors, apparently, allegedly. So we shall see how that plays out. I'm with you. I'm also not a big fan, James, of financial punishments, because they're generally in the low hundreds of thousands, and they're in the realms of a lot of clubs, like the Cities of the world, will just pay it and move on. I think like a transfer ban is more impactful on a club than potentially a financial fine.
Well, that's what Everton were going for, right? Was the transfer ban rather than obviously.
I mean, we've seen it with the likes of Barcelona. I would say ban restrictions that are put into place, like with La Liga, when Barca had no money, they had to submit their accounts. They're like, okay, well, you're limited to who you can sign and how many players you can register and so on. If that was the case, then I think a lot of clubs would take that particularly seriously, because that could have an impact on a city.
I'm glad you mentioned Barcelona, because we should note here that Everton haven't pulled any levers.
Yeah. Because this is the ironic thing as well. When I look at it, I'm like 19.5 million. That's selling one player. Like if they just sold Jordan Pickford for 30 million, would that then be okay? Because they've made that money back.
Essentially, yes.
It's one player.
But then
one good player.
The point of that would be
debatable.
That Everton could have sold Pickford or Onana, for example, maybe they would have, I don't know, if Calvert-Lewin had stayed fit, etc., he would have been an asset, but obviously no one was going to kind of buy him for the value
and let's not forget, Richarlison 60 million, Anthony Gordon 45. There's 105 million there already.
Well, this is it.
So
this is the other.
It won't be. I don't know what they got
from a neutral perspective. We did a podcast last January where we looked at finance of all the teams, and I said then, and I've repeated this several times over, that Everton were in for 5 years of pain. We're not even into year 2 yet. And that was because the situation was so bad on them, based on, reports Kieran Maguire from the Price of Football had done and stuff, that Everton were very much on the tipping edge of FFP on what they wanted to be, i.e. a top 6 club, if you will. They weren't going to get there. They'd already gambled, they'd fell short, and now we're going to essentially have to asset strip. But I think all of us as neutrals could look at Everton over the last 24 months or so, and I think other than that Onana signing, look at them and say, yeah, they've definitely been reining it in. Like, they've not been going mad. This is part of the argument. We're not looking at Everton and saying, right, you failed, and, oh yeah, by the way, you spent 150 million in the summer. Like, all the money that Everton spent on their 2 signings in the summer for financial fees, Beto and Chamiti, are all based on like future payments. They didn't actually expenditure anything in terms of the summer transfer window. So I think that would probably be more the point, I think, of Everton's mitigation, would be to look and say, look, you can see we have been trying here. I think the problem is exactly what you said. The reality is one big sale and they'd be under this and they wouldn't have the point deduction. But then an Evertonian might argue and say, well, Jordan Pickford will get us the 10 points that will keep us up this year. Amadou Onana, maybe, in terms of Everton's midfield, has been a big problem for a long time, and certainly he's helped that area. I think one of the reports even did suggest that Everton had said that their midfield was non-existent, and it was part why they needed to spend money in the first instance. A lot of that, again, spent very badly, unfortunately.
Do you think this takeover is going to happen? Because I'm very 30% likely to happen at the moment. I just don't think they've got enough money.
They've already loaned Everton a fairly substantial amount of money, haven't they?
30 million from memory.
So they're already invested in Everton. I think the takeover would be bad, but the falling apart of the takeover might be worse. That's how it feels.
That doesn't make sense, James. The takeover is good for them, or it's not.
Well, the takeover going through will obviously get the person that Everton most want out at the moment, Mashiri, and a few other board members, get them out and get it start. I think the problem would be, what's the long-term vision of this group? And as we said, there's some shady stuff about them that we've covered in the past as well that is alarming. But I also, if it doesn't go through, like, I don't know what's coming next for Everton from a takeover perspective. That's the point. Like, who wants to buy it at the moment when it's teetering like this?
It's going to be very difficult.
Now, get forward to 5 years of pain, and if Everton are settled and established themselves mid-table Premier League club, sorry, I know it's not what Evertonians want to hear, but in the short term, and they're in that new stadium, etc., maybe, sure. But we've seen other clubs where it's like, the investment's been there in terms of stadiums, etc., and it's like, look at Tottenham now, it's like, it's almost unsellable, right?
Because it's too expensive?
Yeah. Once Everton get into the new stadium, the value is going to start going up at a football club, right? It's going to start generating and being self-sufficient eventually once they get
there. Maybe Mashiri won't want to sell it or need to sell it because it will generate cash.
But the reason, essentially, that Everton are in this problem now is not through... Essentially, they've cheated, but I don't think they've cheated intentionally. I think...
They've just been foolish.
Almost like a modern-day version of Leeds. And what Leeds did, Leeds gambled massively, right? And it hurt Leeds for 20 years, basically. Everton's gamble might hurt Everton for 20 years in terms of they were going for that quick gamble to, get in the Champions League, for example, and then, okay, this will be self-sufficient. And as Everton are going to be playing catch-up for a long time, because while they're they're sitting there. You've got all these other clubs like your Villas, your West Hams, etc. Going, we're going to spend. Even clubs like Forest, right? And we're going to be ambitious. Also, it's worth saying, look at an example like Wolves to kind of argue against Everton, where Wolves come out in the summer, didn't they? And they said, well, we're under FFP restriction. We can't do a lot here. And I know a lot of Wolves fans question that, but probably sat there this week and went, I'm glad that's not me.
Yeah, exactly that. You don't want to overstretch yourselves.
So there is another club who we've got who've been in a similar position over the last couple of years to Everton and have been restricted, who have gone, we know we're in trouble here and we're going to explain that to our supporters, and therefore haven't pushed over the line. Everton will obviously appeal this decision. I think they've got a case to at least get a deduction on the points. They're not going to get it completely overturned. I think that's like near a certainty. But they will face a different panel. And I think there is some scope for getting a turnover of the final result. Part of that is because the Premier League don't have an actual written definition of what the punishment should be, right? Like we know the punishment for administration. Richard Masters supposedly said in August, the chairman of the Premier League, supposedly said that a breach of FFP was going to be 6 million, okay, just on the base of it. And
fine.
6-point deduction, sorry. And every 5 million over that would be another point.
Right.
Now, the independent panel that concluded Everton's final 10-point deduction said they did not use that as a guide. But 19.5 million is very close to 5 times 4 equals an additional 4 points on top of 6. There's a case to say as well that I think Everton believe they can get about 10 million. That is very debatable, which they want to push through. And I think there's a case to say Everton might get 1 or 2 points off of this.
Yeah, I was going to suggest 6 to 8 points is where I think it will end up.
Well, most of the journalists were expecting 4 to 6 points, it seems like.
6 might be the magic number.
But I also, and I think we've mentioned this, we think Everton will stay up. If there's never a good time to get a 10-point deduction, but if ever there was such a thing, it might be now, because Everton have a chance, and they wouldn't have had a chance in other seasons. And there is a little bit of me as a football fan that thinks, take one for the team here, lads.
Yeah, because then Man City and everyone else that follows can get really the boot.
I don't have anything personal against City, Chelsea's a rival, fine, whatever. But I think if people have gamed the system and actually got advantage from it, then it needs to be dealt with. In terms of City, we're not going to get a verdict soon. I think we've been clear on that for a long time. It is going to take time. As I said, it's taken, 8 months or so to get is one decision on Everton. There are 115 on Manchester City. I don't quite know or understand how they're going to go about this final decision, though, because I even think, like, let's say they went, right, yeah, we're going to expel City, and you've got the appeal. Like, I don't know, it's just going to get dealt with in like 6 weeks or so. What do you do about fixture lists and planning for next season? What league do they go in? Like, do you even just suspend them for 2 years and play with 19 teams? Or, like, what do you even do?
Bizarre. I think it's going to be very difficult to
come
up with a punishment.
There's a lot of people think they should be stripped of all the trophies they've won.
Nah. I'm not a fan of retro. I'm just not a fan of going back retrospectively and rewriting history.
Neither am I. I mean, there's one case.
Does that mean Lance Armstrong can keep all his Tour de France's?
No, well, no. It's a very fair point.
Similar
it's also
argument, you know?
Like, my team finished second to Chelsea in 1 year, right? If Chelsea got stripped of their trophies, oh yeah, Tottenham won the league in 2017. What am I going to do? Have a party? Like, it's hollow. It doesn't feel like nothing. My team weren't the best team in the league that year. Chelsea were. So I'm
not a fan of retro, mate. If I'm honest with you, as much as it hurts a little bit, I get it. Rewriting history is difficult, but it happens with Olympic medals all the time. Happens with Tour de France all the time. But I don't know. In this team dynamic in the league, the way the league is structured, I don't think it makes sense to retrospectively start stripping trophies.
No. One final thing as well, I think on Everton, I mentioned Leicester City. there's 6 clubs that have an opportunity now to put forward an appeal against Everton for financial losses. Some of them are laughable, like, Southampton. You appointed Nathan Jones. You don't get anything, I'm sorry. Leeds have a little bit of a case, I think on a couple of million, because they'd have finished above Everton if they'd got that 10-point deduction a couple of years ago. Leicester City and Burnley are the 2 clubs obviously been directly impacted by relegations through finishing one place below Everton, right, over the last couple of seasons. In Burnley's case, they're obviously now back in the Premier League. And the irony I find with that is Burnley could sue Everton, get money off Everton, and then finish above Everton because Everton got a points deduction.
That's triple whammy, isn't it? That's Christmas is coming.
So then do Everton sue Burnley? I think it's going to be a bit messy. That the other thing to consider that is, let's say Leicester sued Everton, and there was an agreement to pay a substantial amount of money to Leicester for losses of not being in the Premier League this year. Imagine then we bring that conversation back into Manchester City and the teams that missed out on Champions League football because of Manchester City. You think that the greedy 6, and I support one of them, the greedy 6 aren't going to, imagine.
Yeah.
Imagine if they all went for City under that circumstance, or they all went for Chelsea. I'm not in agreement with that in terms of, I don't think there's much for Burnley or Leicester to go for, but there is a case, Suj, and it's a while ago, that involved your team.
Sheffield United.
And Carlos Tevez.
Money was paid.
And I don't think it's right to look back and say, well, West Ham didn't get a points deduction in 2007, I think it was, because of the Tevez and Mascherano stuff. And you'd have to, ironically, with that, you'd have to say that Tevez kept you up.
Yep.
Like he did have a
sporting impact.
A sporting impact on the final league table with the goals that he scored in the last couple of months of that season. I do think if that circumstance had happened now, you would have gone down. You would have faced the sporting punishment, and it would have been dealt with. That was settled out of court eventually between West Ham and Sheffield United. Now, back then, West Ham gave Sheffield United, I think it was somewhere between 20 and 30 million.
20.
Now, what's that as a value now?
You're talking 15 years. I'd say you could times it by 2 at least.
So the case there would be, would Leicester or Burnley have the case to chase Everton for that sort of money?
Perhaps.
Which would then only make Everton struggle even further with FFP in future years, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I feel sorry for Evertonians. It's always with this one, it's the fans who get the punishment the worst, right? But I do think you should take solace in what we've said, that I think it'll be all right.
Yeah, they'll still stay up. And if they do still stay up, then this will be...
I said on this podcast last Monday when we reviewed their win at Palace, I said they're safe already. They were on obviously 14 points. You're looking at that advantage they had over the 3 promoted teams, so they're not catching that. And I think Everton have had a better fixture list than most of those teams down them at the bottom, but they've mitigated it with the 3 away wins at Brentford, West Ham and Crystal Palace, have evened that out against some of the really bad home results. They're obviously going to make Goodison Park their own kind of fortress. They're going to feel like it's them against the world, right? And I think any team going there in the near future is going to... You're going to feel like we're playing an FA Cup quarter-final away from home, and Everton going to make it tough. And I think as long as Everton keep their key players through their spine of the team, so the goalkeeper, the 2 centre-backs, Onana, ironically, and Calvert-Lewin fit, which is never a guarantee with Calvert-Lewin, but at least they have a replacement now in Beto, that I think they'll be fine.
Yeah, I agree with you, James.
They'll be fine. And if the players get it right on the pitch and the fans get behind the team, it will create something where Everton will stay up, and we'll look at it as a really good achievement for Everton at the end of the season if they finish 17th or higher.
Indeed. Listeners, of course, there's going to be plenty of opinions floating around on this, so jump in the comments on YouTube and let us know what you think.
Pod on it.
And once the appeal is done, James, we'll be revisiting this topic and seeing where we go with it, because there's a lot more to unpack. On Patreon today, James, we're looking at the offside rule.
The Wenger law. I'm not going to give my opinion on it right now.
But we shall talk about that. We've got Sky Fantasy Football coming tomorrow.
Luke Williams is joining me on that 27th overall at the moment, smashing it.
Yes, and Tottenham Arse tomorrow as well. If you want to support the show, you can head over to patreon.com/Planet FPL, where you get all of the additional content, Slack channel, prize leagues, and a whole bunch of other stuff as well.
Including saying things about Manchester City that we're less inclined to say here.
On the main show. Other than that, though, thank you for tuning in. Make sure you're subscribed wherever you're listening to the podcast, and we'll be back at you tomorrow. Stay safe. Ciao for now.
Thanks, everyone. Be nice to each other. Cue music, please, man child.